I'd like to start out tonight by saying that it's a pleasure for me to be here and share information with you about my dad and his service in World War II. I'm paying tribute to him and all the millions of men and women that served. And tonight, in trying to tell, say, his story, I felt that it was important that I try to tell the story of the role that the type of ship he served on played in World War II. And I don't know how familiar you are with an LST called a landing ship tank, but I'm going to, as we go through the program, try to inform you a little bit about these ships. General Eisenhower said that the two most important weapons were the Higgins boat and the M1 rifle, but General Marshall said the most important weapon was the LST and helped him win World War II. I'd like to start out by saying my sources that I put my program together from. I've got conversations that I had with my father. I didn't have a lot of conversations with him. I had more conversations with my mother, relaying the things that he told about when he came home after World War II. And she being a school teacher, a lot of that's written down in her own handwriting, which has proved to be a treasure to me. I did use some published works. There's one book called Neptune by Craig Simons, which is the story of all the amphibious landings in Europe, North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and Normandy. It's a detailed book, but to me it was very easy reading concerning World War II. There's a very brief book called Landing Ship Tank, just a very brief history of the LST in World War II, Korea, and in Vietnam. And of course, Stephen Ambrose is supposed to be the authority on D-Day, and I took some material from him. I've got newspaper articles. I also found some declassified memorandums from the Department of the Navy that pertain to my dad's ship. And I guess you could say my real jackpot was several years ago. After my mother's death, I was going through information. She kept a scrapbook on my dad through his entire life, and I was looking back through the World War II, and I was fishing around for information online, and I ran across a diary of LST 293. The man on the left, James Cosgrove, was a shipmate on my dad's, and he was from Davenport, Iowa. And from January of 1944 through November of 1944, he maintained a diary, a log, and he had entries almost every day. And when I started reading that, I discovered very quickly that there were situations and incidents that happened that my dad had told about. I became very interested in it, so much to the point that I began to sort of question, was he on that ship? You see in the background here a photo of the crew on the ship, and he wore glasses. That was the only photo in his diary. My mom pointed him out. She always drew a line. You see, as I said, my mom would draw an arrow, and she'd put Yates in the perimeter, so I found him real easy. But Cosgrove, I used a magnifying glass, and I found him on the back row. They're circled here, but you can't see them clearly. So I felt pretty confident that this guy was on the level. Now, sometimes he was a couple of years younger than my dad, and a few times I think he got a little Hollywoodish maybe in his descriptions, but he described, and I'm going to relate to you several things that happened that they both were aware of. About 2 weeks ago, my son discovered an interview with a man that was attached to LST 293 named Shields Wilson. He was from Tennessee. He was a student at Vanderbilt. He was born in 1920. And when the war broke out, he went into the Navy, and he went into the officer program. And he was not really part of the crew, but every LST carried a certain number of Higgins boats, and we'll talk about those. And that was his job, was a commander of several of those Higgins boats. And he had a very detailed interview. It was very professional, and he described some of the same events. So I felt like I had pretty good sources for tonight. Now, my dad was born Yates Winthrop Hancock. He was born here in Nashville, March the 25th, 1917. His parents were John William Will Hancock and Rebecca Ray Hancock. And he grew up here. This is his second grade photo, and he's there on a tobacco sled. He grew up. His father loved to hunt and fish, and he got it from his dad, and I got it from him, and it's sort of been a family tradition. In 1936, Dad graduated from Nashville High School. He was a classmate of Colonel Jack Knight, that was a pilot in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Bill Perry Sr. was one of his classmates, and Howard Bradford and Emmett Williams and all of those people, they graduated together. And when Dad was in high school, he played football and basketball and baseball, track. And his high school coach was a man named Joe Sam Robinson. And at that time, what was formerly Tifton A&M had become ABAC. ABAC had a football team. And my dad's high school coach arranged with the coach at ABAC, a gentleman named Orrin Mitchell, who coached Fred Tucker at Georgia Military, for my dad to join the football team. Now, I don't know if you would call it a football scholarship, but my dad always said that was part of the financial arrangement that got him into ABAC. His dad was a clerk in a store here in Nashville for Alva Gaskins for probably 30 or 40 years, and they had income, but he could not have gone to ABAC. So he attended that year, played on the football team. I remember he told me he had both ankles severely sprained. That winter, the gymnasium burned up and ABAC dropped football. So he was able to go back the next year, and they arranged for him to work in a student canteen. I guess it was something like a bookstore or student center, but he graduated from ABAC in 1938. My mom was born in Burke County in 1920. She had 7 sisters. Her father and mother, Tate and Mary Williams Butler, were farmers. They had their own land. They had sharecrop families. She and all of her sisters graduated from high school. She went to GSCW in Milledgeville. And while she was there, she waited on tables to financially pay for her education. And while she was there, she met a young lady from Nashville named Marjorie Futch, who later was Marjorie Futch Watson. And my mother came here in 1938 to teach, and Marjorie introduced my mom and dad, and in 1939 they were married. My mom taught school in the old 2-story building that's where the city hall's at now, and my dad had gotten a job with Georgia Power at South Georgia Ice Company, which was located just west of Dogwood toward where the middle school is. We know what happened in 1941 when the war got started. He didn't enlist. He had a deferment in 1942 because of his job, and he told me that his employer, his supervisor, told him he could probably give him another one in 43, but my dad said he didn't want one. Now, he didn't enlist, but he got drafted in 1943. And the photo on the back is taken before he went to the Great Lakes. He went to the Great Lakes basic training, and he and Jimmy Griffin's daddy, Preston Griffin, were in the same basic training unit, but Preston went to the Pacific and Dad ended up going to the Atlantic. Now, these photos were when he was home from boot camp. And following this, he went to Memphis, Tennessee for a short while. And then he was told he was going to New Orleans to join his ship, which was going to be an LST. And my mom had a chance to go and be with him a few days. All right, let's talk about the LST a little bit. These craft, the LSTs, were built on sea, not at seaports usually, but on rivers. The Ohio River ran from Pittsburgh all the way down to Evansville in Ohio. And these were built there so they wouldn't take up space in the big shipyards where they were building battleships and aircraft carriers. And they would be constructed and then they would be floated down to Mississippi. Now, an LST was about 320 feet long. It was 50 feet wide. It was an amphibious. It was designed to go on land. And it was the largest of all the amphibious craft. It was 327 long, 50 feet wide. It had a flat bottom, which could allow it to float up on the beach. At the front, it had a ramp, and it had doors that would open up, and anything that was inside could be driven out or carried out. It usually had about 10 officers and about 100 sailors. It had a couple of unusual features. When it was empty, it was very difficult to maneuver. And they had tanks that they could take in seawater, which would sink the craft down and allow it to maneuver. And then when they needed to, they could empty that out. They also, when these ships would go on the beach, it was very important to go in at a 90-degree angle. You didn't want to go in sideways. They would try to go in straight ahead at high tide. And when they got a certain distance from the coast or the shoreline, they would drop an anchor, which was attached with a cable. And when the tide went out, they would unload. When the tide came back in, they would reverse their engines and pull themselves out on that winch. So it was very unusual. The first ones were built in 1942, and then they started building them. There would be 1,000 built that would be used in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. They were flat. They had 3 decks. Some people get these confused with the smallest amphibious craft, which was a Higgins boat. The Higgins boat opened at the front, but the Higgins boat was only 36 feet long and it carried men. You could carry personnel on an LST, but most of the time they were carrying equipment and cargo. They could carry between 18 and 22 tanks based on the size. They could carry 33 3-ton trucks, and then on the top deck, in either one of those cargoes, they could carry, I forget how many Jeeps. So it could carry a tremendous amount of equipment. The sailors that served on them said the LST stood for large, slow target. An LST could go up between 8 and 10 knots. A knot is 1.15 miles an hour. A battleship can go 33 miles an hour. A destroyer can go 30 miles an hour. So you can see that they probably were not very comfortable in doing that. They were armed. The only defense they had would be anti-aircraft guns. They had anywhere from 18 to 20. That would be 20 millimeter, 40 millimeter, or 50 caliber machine guns. And these guns would require 3 to 4 men, so over half of the ship's crew, when they got into a battle situation, would be on those guns up on the top deck. We go to New Orleans. Daddy got there in February. He got to New Orleans and joined his ship in February. The crews, 99% of the crews had never been to sea. They were green. They said if you had a captain that had sea experience, you were very lucky. And my dad had the captain of his ship was Captain Camps, K-A-M-P-S, and he had joined the Navy in 1929. So he was very experienced. And later, the diary that James Cosgrove has, he described him as being gung-ho, and we'll talk a little bit about that. They left New Orleans. Once the crew was assembled, they left New Orleans coming east on the Gulf Coast. They would practice as far as Panama City, landing on the beaches and getting off the beaches. They got to New York March the 11th, and March the 29th, they joined the convoy at Halifax, Nova Scotia, which was bound for England. On April the 6th, now this was described by my dad, it was described by Cosgrove, and it was described by Shields Wilson. A convoy would have any number of ships in it, and it would have a few destroyers on the outside to hopefully protect it. But when they reached a certain point in the North Atlantic, they were open game for the German submarines. In 1943, the German submarines had started operating in wolf packs. They wouldn't operate individually. They would put 8 to 9 of them together, and if they could get into a convoy, they could really begin sinking ships. And on the night of April the 6th, my dad described the attack that they had. 4 ships were sunk. My dad described a tanker just going up like a ball of fire. There were 4 ships totally sunk. LST 293, and this account was supported by the 2 other individuals. A torpedo hit the rear of the ship, and it damaged the rudder, and it damaged one of the propellers, but it did not explode. And that was technically described this when they got to England and they got into dry dock. So that was a very, I'm sure, nerve-wracking situation. 2 days later, they got into a large storm. My dad spoke of the storm. They were happy to get in the storm because that meant that they weren't going to probably be attacked by the U-boats. They arrived in Falmouth, England on April the 14th. Now I'm getting these dates from the guy with the diary, not my dad. And they went into dry dock to get their ship repaired. Now, once they get to England, this is like I said, this is April of 1944. The invasion, they didn't know it, but the invasion was set for June of 1944. So while they were there, they were moving materials up and down the coast from Falmouth to Plymouth to Southampton. All these seaports on the eastern side of the English Channel were where the troops would embark from. The invasion force that was going would not come out of one seaport. It would come out of a number of them because of the logistics. Now, we've already talked about the U-boats were a constant threat to an LST. Another threat, the Germans had mined the English Channel with magnetic mines. They had those, I guess, by thousands in various points, anywhere they thought there might be a congregation of ships. So the mines were there. Another threat that was described in the diary, and my dad spoke of these 2 things. At night, the German Air Force had not been completely wiped out in 1944 at this point. They could fly from France, and usually most of these were fighter bombers that would at night, they knew where these seaports were at. They didn't know actually what was in it, but they would just take pot luck, and they would come over at night and bomb, and on occasion sunk various types of ships that were there. The Germans had just started using the V-1 rocket, which was called a buzz bomb. It was an unmanned rocket plane. It had a huge warhead, and These would be launched against London in number. They were over 2,000 launched against London, but sometimes they would strike these seaports. And they said that you knew when it was coming down, when it stopped buzzing, it was going to come down. And these were used a lot during the daytime. Artillery, once the invasion started, another threat that these ships, all of these ships would be under. There'd be 7,000 ships in the armada that struck Normandy, but the Germans had artillery inland, and this artillery could be directed with spotters on the beach, and later they used spotters in planes. And until the Germans were driven the distance required to get them out of range, they would always be under a lot of fire from artillery. They started loading, according to the diary, May the 29th, LST 293 took on doctors and took on medical corpsmen, and they took on 350 stretchers. On June the 2nd, they had a way that they could pull into a seaport, and in the seaport there had been built concrete ramps like a beach where the LST could just float up and load up and pull off. They loaded in reverse order. Whatever was going to come off first went on last, and they would back. If they were loading tanks or loading trucks, they would back them in and they would chain them down. And once they got it loaded, they pulled out into the harbor, and all communication was cut off from any source, because they knew this time was ramping up. On June the 4th, the captain briefed the crew. He told them where they were going, because they couldn't talk to anybody. They were off coast. And the invasion started on June the 6th. Now, there were 7,000 ships, and there's no way I can imagine this. They weren't all together. They were lined up for miles out into the English Channel. There were no LSTs went ashore on June the 6th. They tried to put 2 on shore at Omaha, but it was so rough and hot that they decided not to. So the bombardment went on. They knew that the Higgins boat was the smallest of the amphibious. It was 36 feet long and about 10 feet wide, and it carried 40 men. If you saw Saving Private Ryan, that's what they went into the beach on. Those Higgins boats were carried over on LSTs, and the LST could carry personnel, but it was primarily equipment and supplies. So the Higgins boats would be released to go out to the transport ships and pick up the troops, and it was they were going to be the ones that went in first. All this went on that day. It started at 6:30 and 7:30. Eisenhower wanted to start the invasion at the same time on each beach, but because of the curvature, the times were between 6:30 and 7:30 when they started. But by that night, they had enough men ashore that they established a beachhead. One weapon my dad spoke of with very seriousness was at the top. The Germans had a type of torpedo boat, I can't pronounce it, Schnellboot or fast boat to some point. It was a version of the American PT boat, but it was bigger and it was faster. It carried 8 torpedoes, and these E-boats would operate out of the French coast. They would come out. They could go 45 miles an hour. They were fast, and they could come out at night and go into the English Channel, and anything they saw, they would try to sink it. My dad was involved in a situation. He didn't know about it at the time, but the man that did the interview, Shields Wilson, described this. General Eisenhower insisted that there be a practice exercise done before the invasion. So in April, they set about April the 28th, they had a village on the southeast coast of England called Slapton Sands, They moved everybody out of the village, moved the residents out. It was a perfect beach because it compared with the beaches that they were going to attack at Normandy. And they had it set up to do it basically like they were going to do it on the live run. There were 8 LSTs that were carrying a number of several hundred American soldiers. And on that night, the E-boats got in that flotilla, and they sank 3 of the LSTs. According to Shields Wilson, LST 293 was supposed to be in that flotilla, but it was not. For what reason, he didn't know. But to show you how critical this was, they had calculated that they would need at least 230 LSTs to conduct the invasion on D-Day. And General Eisenhower, when this happened, he almost considered postponing it to a much later date. It was set in June because in June, twice a year, they have what they call high tide, where the tides would be as much as 2 feet more than normal, which would allow smaller craft to go over German obstacles. But fortunately, it was not postponed. Okay, let's go to the map. This is a map of the beaches. It was a 50-mile area from the, I guess this would be the north to the south. And there was about 8 to 10 miles for each beach that would be attacked. Now, LST 293 went in at Gold Beach. And Gold Beach, they were carrying British troops. The Canadians had Sword, Canadians and the British had Juneau, and of course the Americans had Omaha and Utah. This was their destination. They didn't know, they knew they were going. They didn't know where and they didn't know when. That's about the only thing the Allies had on their side, was because Hitler had been fortifying the coast of Europe since the early 1940s. LST 293 went on the beach on D-Day +1. It went on the beach June 7th. They unloaded their cargo. They were supposed to have taken on 300 wounded. They took on 480. They waited for the tide, and on June the 10th, they were back across the channel. They were the first ship back in to Portsmouth. I don't know about the other ports because there were people there waiting on them. So from the time the invasion started, it was constant. The LST they would come on the beach, they would unload, they would back off, they would carry prisoners, they would carry wounded back to England, they would reload, they would come back. There were no seaports available. I hadn't really thought a lot about this until I was reading the book on Neptune, but you think about it, there was a seaport nearby, not too far from this area, called Cherbourg. It was a big seaport. Well, the Germans had it fortified. The Germans weren't going to let the Allies have it. It was not until August that Cherbourg would even be taken, and then the Germans had destroyed everything on the docks, so they had to use landing on the beach. That was the way. Between June the 6th and July the 4th, they would put 1 million men on the coast of France. So this was just a constant process of going back and forth. They were the threat of airplanes. They were the threat of the U-boats were in service up until the very end of the war, not in large numbers, but they were in a serious situation. The top photo would have been what it looked like, I'm sure, D-Day +1, +2, +3. The photo of LST 293 that's here was a photo my dad brought home. This was not during one of those early days, because you can see there's not any carnage or anything on the beach. But he brought this photo on the bottom right home, and Cosgrove in his diary explained that while the ship was being loaded or unloaded, some of the crewmen went out and decided to have a football game. I think you might be able to see the football there. While they were doing this, a German plane came down, the crews on the ship shot him down. And this was, I don't know if that was the end of the ball game that day, but it shows where sports is in America. It was there during the early days. This was constant going back. Sometimes they would go to Utah Beach, sometimes they would go to Omaha Beach. It was wherever they had to get to unload and get the troops across. A couple of the LSTs, not LST 293, but a couple of them were outfitted as hospital ships. And in the month of June, they carried back over 40,000 wounded to the hospitals in England, because there were no hospitals really set up in France at that time that could take care of them. This process just went on and went on. One of the defenses that the LST had and the other ships had was what they call a degaussing coil. I don't know, Skeeter Mike could hit me on this, but the German mines were magnetic, and by some means they were able to install a device that would neutralize the German sea mines so that they could float over them or they could go by them. In September, Cosgrove wrote in his diary that they were, at that time, LST 293 was leading the race as far as crossing the English Channel the most times. He said the captain knew that the degaussing coil had gone out, but he wanted to keep the record going because he was bucking for a promotion. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but he wrote it in his diary, but they did get the degaussing coil reinstalled. This is a memo from November of 1944 that Navy indicated LST 293, and there's one other ship listed there, at that time were believed to have made the most crossings over the English Channel. And also at the top is an article from the Atlanta Journal that was in February of 1945, and it is specifically on LST 293. It mentions the captain. Marcus Childs was the writer who did that story, and he was on the ship, and he described the conditions that they were under, but that they just kept going and kept going. This will continue until actually the last days of the war. In October, they began to branch out. The Germans were being driven back, and the ships could go farther. LST 293 went to Ostend, Belgium, carrying supplies. At the very last stages of the war, they actually went into Hamburg, Germany. They could go up a river, and they went up the Rhine River to Hamburg. My dad commented that Hamburg had been bombed in 1943 for 8 days and 7 nights in a row with incendiary bombs, where they just firebombed, and he said there wasn't much left of Hamburg that he could see. On May the 7th, Germany surrendered. May the 8th, according to Shields Wilson, LST 293 was the first ship back in Southampton. And they, at that time, set up an open house where they let the people in the town come out and go on the ship. And they had oranges set up. And he told of this little girl that came up, and Shields Wilson was describing his empathy for the English people and how much they suffered during World War II from 1939 until 45. The little girl went up and got an orange and said, "Mama, look, an orange. We had an orange one time." And he was describing this in a very emotional way. The war comes to an end. Okay, that's my dad back in New York. What kind of beer was that?
Old-fashioned.
That's Daddy and some of his buddies. As Harry Truman said, they were striking a blow for liberty there. But they were in New York to get refitted and go to the Pacific. But in August, we know that the war ended, and Daddy was discharged, I believe, in November. Daddy got out in 45 and I was born in September of 1946. There's your war baby right there. Many of you were, I'm sure, the same classification as a war baby. My mom went back to teaching, and Dad, for a few years, worked with what they call a home farm training program, where they had a program set up for veterans that had had their lives interrupted. And on the current campus where the board office is at, there's a little red brick building down by the gym that was built to house that operation. And he was, I think W.R. Roberts was an instructor in that, and he's there with Howard Futch, and they were checking the corn crops, what they were doing there. My dad, you know, I guess life has a lot of strange twists in it, but my dad, having gone overseas and served in the Navy, went through the dangers that he suffered. He and a friend of his that he retired with, he later, after he left the home farm training program, he went to Moody and became the entomologist there. He became the bug man in the late 50s, and he worked there until 82, I believe, and he retired. But he and a friend of his were fishing in the Okmulgee River, and he drowned. My mother retired from teaching. She passed away in 2010. She had been retired 33 years from teaching. So I broke her teaching record by 1 year, so I'm going to try to break her retirement by at least one. I can say that that Berrien County, these people came home from the war. They didn't ask anybody for anything. I never heard my parents complain about what happened. They came home, they tried to put their lives together, put their families together, and move on. But I feel like Berrien County has always sort of been at the front runner of recognizing veterans. We didn't do it in a big way, but I believe, Brian, the monument on the square was one of the first erected after World War I. Is that correct?
Yeah.
And I remember vividly the names that were on the west wall of the McLam building, which have been transferred to the community center. And we've always, I think, remembered those people. We didn't have maybe the money to do it in a grand way. My parents were great parents, and I know yours were, and I got so much from them. I was thinking just recently, my high school graduation was on the night of June 6, 1964. And my grandfather Hancock had passed away, but my grandmother, my dad, and my mom were there watching me graduate in what was then the new gym, but now is the gone gym. And I've often wondered if they even thought about the fact that that was June 6, 1944. But if they did, I hope they had pleasant memories about it, because my memories have been very, very pleasant with them. And pay tribute to all the millions of men and women that served this country during this. This is just one little small story.
Here to tell Sergeant Lambert's story is this year's Academy Award nominated actor, Sam Elliott.
We were headed to Omaha Beach, and I was glad. After all the fighting in Africa and Sicily, I just wanted to get this war over with. It was daylight on the 6th. I went up on deck and found my brother Bill there. We talked about our chances and what our parents would think. About 6 a.m., the signal came to go to stations. My brother and I promised whoever survived would take care of the other's family. And we shook hands and went our separate ways. I climbed down the nets and got into the Higgins boat with my unit. On the way in, we could hear the battleships firing. and see the big shells landing ahead of us. Guys were getting sick and vomiting from the choppy water and the diesel fumes. As we got in closer, the Germans had a bird's eye view of us coming in. We picked up machine gun fire. The bullets clanged against the metal ramp of the boat like hail. Then the big 88s on the hill opened up. Every time a shell whistled overhead, all you could hear was the sound of a banshee screaming. Boats around us were burning. I saw men on fire. Even their shoes were on fire. Dead and wounded were floating in the water. We had orders not to stop and pick anyone up. I told my men, when the ramp drops, hit the water hard and keep as low as you can to dodge the bullets. We sank up over our heads. That was the last time I saw most of them. 31 men jumped off that boat. Just 7 of them made it to the beach. The only cover was a block of concrete the Germans had failed to clear. That's where I set up a collection point for the casualties. Medics were trained not to dig in. We were there to see the troops and for them to see us. I detailed Corporal Raymond Lepore to hunker down and treat the men while I brought in the injured. Ray and I had been together since '39. I knew I could count on him. It was total confusion. Shells exploding, boats blowing up, people yelling because they couldn't hear anything, machine gun bullets hitting the water all around you, the roar of the boats coming in. It's like you're all alone in a world of 1 million people because you're concentrating on what you have to do. Hadn't gone far when I felt a bullet go through my right arm. I just kept going. I was thinking of only one thing, getting to the men who needed me. There was a soldier laying right on the edge of the water. One arm was almost shot off. Every time a wave would come in, that arm would be pulled back out to sea, and he'd try to reach out for it. The first thing you're supposed to do is keep a wounded man from going into shock. But he was too far gone. Nothing I could do for him. He died in my arms. I was on my way to treat another soldier when a piece of shrapnel the size of my hand tore a hole in my left thigh. I put a tourniquet on it, gave myself a shot of morphine, and went back to work. You did the job you were trained to do. If you didn't, you died. I could feel my right arm going numb from the first bullet. Saw a guy struggling in chest-deep water. Grabbed him with my good arm just as a Higgins boat rolled in and dropped its ramp. The ramp hit me right in the back, crushed 2 vertebrae, and pushed us both to the bottom. That's when I started talking to the one guy I knew could help me. I said, God, I've asked you many times, but just give me another chance. Let me save one more person. And for some reason, that boat raised its ramp and backed out. Somehow I managed to drag his boat to safety. I told Corporal Lepore he'd have to take my place. He stood up, and then he just collapsed against my shoulder. His helmet fell off, and I saw the hole right in the center. Everything went black after that. The next thing I knew, I was on a boat going back to England. A Navy doctor looked at my dog tags and he told me, we have another Lambert here. My brother's Bill's stretcher was put right next to mine on the dock at Weymouth. He'd been on the beach with G Company. We went to the hospital in the same ambulance. When I woke up, he was on the cot next to me. He looked over and said, what are you doing here? Same thing you are, I told him. And he said, oh God, now what's Mother gonna think? We both made it out okay. Bill lived to be 92. People who have never been in a war should understand what soldiers give up. The guys we left on Omaha Beach never had a chance to live the lives they've dreamed of. Day hasn't gone by when I haven't prayed for the men we lost and their families. I still wake up at night sometimes thinking about the guys. Every man that walked into those machine guns and that artillery fire on Omaha Beach that day, every man was a hero. What kind of person would I be if I didn't tell their stories? Such an honor, sir, to tell your story. God bless you.